Welcome to Python by example. This is the second session in our series. And if you have not yet watched the first session, then I encourage you to take some time and have a look at it. Because this session is building on the concepts that we would have covered in that first session. What we want to do in this session, particularly, is to have a look at the concept of conditional statements and how they can modify the execution of our program. So typically, in terms of our programs, there is something that is called the program flow, which determines the order in which the commands are executed. By default, the program flow will operate in a sequential manner, meaning that the code executes in a top-down fashion. The first command that is seen is the first command that is executed, which means in this case, particularly, line 1 would be executed before line 2, which would then be executed before line 4, and we continue in that same trend until we have completed all the codes which are inside of this particular program. This sequential operation, however, is not going to be enough because there are going to be times in our program when we want to choose which statement or set of statements we actually want to execute. And that is the purpose of conditionals. So I will first of all demonstrate once more what this particular program does. And then after that, I will modify it so that you can have a look at the conditionals. You can see it in action and you can see how things are changed whenever we make use of the conditionals. So let us execute. We're asked to enter our first name, which is Bob. We're asked to enter our last name, which is Marley. We're asked to enter our age. We're going to enter 24. Remember, this is going to be actually 24, the string 24, which is then going to be converted into an integer. And then we're going to add 1 to that integer, giving us 25. We hit enter, and we're seeing that we are displaying all the elements of our variables, namely first name, last name, and age, or the representation thereof. And finally, at the end, we are displaying a message that indicates that we have reached the end of the program. And this is denoted by line 12, which was added recently to the program. So far, there are no surprises. You would have already been familiar with this, having looked at the first session. So let's clear the output. And then we are now going to introduce the concept of conditionals. I'm just creating a few more spaces, and I'm going to create a variable called printit. And I'm going to assign the value false to printit. Now, printit is what we call a Boolean variable. We would have spoken about that in the previous session. And you will recall that a Boolean variable is able to store one of two values. It can either store a true value or it can store a false value. In this case, we are allowing it to store a false value, and we are going to use this variable to construct our first conditional. if print it followed by a colon. Now it's important to follow the syntax. And by the way, whenever we talk about syntax, we're talking about the rules of the language. And whenever we write our commands, we have to set it up a particular way so that the rules of the language are satisfied. If we fail to do this, then we end up in a situation where our program will not execute because it will say that we have an error, a syntax error. So it's important to get the syntax correct. Two things to note about line 10. One, it is signaled by the if keyword. And that's going to be a common occurrence within the Python language. Most of the time, once we are signaling a conditional, we will be making use of the if keyword. The other thing that we want to bear in mind is the concept of the print it. So this print it actually stores a Boolean value, which in this case is false. Now, here's how the if statement works. If the if statement evaluates to true, then it will execute all the statements which are linked to it. However, if the if statement evaluates to false, then it will not print or execute the statements which are linked to it. So the question now becomes, how do we link statements to the if command? And we link statements to the if command by indenting them. In order to indent the statements, we need to press the tab key. So I'm going to highlight all the statements that I want to execute, and I'm going to hit the tab key once. And note that we have now indented 3 statements. And what we are saying here is that these 3 statements on lines 11 to 13 are going to be linked to the print statement that is on line 10. Now remember, I did indicate that whenever the statement is true, then we execute the commands which are linked to the if. In this case, however, the print it has the value false. So let's execute and observe what happens. So we are going to enter first name being Bob. We are going to enter Marley. We are going to enter 24 for age. In this case, it's actually 24, which is then going to be converted to 24. And then we are going to add 1 to that, giving us an age of 25. But when we hit the enter key, notice that we are only seeing the print statement that has been placed on line 15. End of the program. What we did not see was an execution of any of the print statements which were actually linked to the if statement. And the reason why this occurred is because when line 10 was evaluated, print it was evaluated to being false. And because print it was evaluated to false, then it means that all the statements which are linked to the if statement would not be executed. Conversely, if we now change print it to true and re-execute, then we should be seeing a difference. So let's clear the output. Let's change it from false to true. And let's re-execute. Once again, we are going to enter Bob Marley with an age of 24. And this time, note that we are now seeing the output, which are linked to the if statement. In other words, we are displaying first name equal Bob. We are displaying last name equal Marley. And we are displaying age equal 25 because remember we had added 1 to the age of 24, which has increased the age to 25. So we can see here quite clearly that the lines from 11 to 13, which are linked to line 10, have all been executed. In addition, we have also printed or executed line 15 because that would be the next thing in the sequence. So the key takeaway here is that we can use the concept of conditionals within the context of a sequential execution or a sequential program flow to determine which statements we want to execute and which statement we want to ignore, and under what criteria or condition do we ignore or do we execute. This is the purpose of using the conditional statements. Now, the challenge that we have with this particular example is that the value true and the value false are determined by the programmer. As you would have seen from our previous session, we want to be able to write dynamic programs wherein it is the user who enters the inputs, the data that determines how the program operates. So we are going to make a slight modification to this code so that we can have that kind of a logic being built into our program. So we have on line 8 kind of change what we are assigning to print it. We are now writing a statement that can be evaluated, and I'm just going to put that statement inside rounded brackets. So it says age is less than or equal to 5. In other words, that symbol combination that we are seeing means less than or equal to. So let's execute the command, this particular program, and let us observe what is going to happen. So it says, enter your first name, which we know is Bob. Enter your last name, which is Marley. And this time we're going to enter 32. Now notice, whenever I enter 32, the statements which are actually linked to the print statement, to the if statement, sorry, they were not printed. They were not executed. And you might be asking the question, why? And let's examine why. We have a statement here that is asking a question. And the question that is being asked here is simply this. Is age less than or equal to 25? To be more precise, is the value in age less than or equal to 25. To answer that question, we have to look at what the user would have entered. And the user would have entered 32 or 32. 32 would have then been converted to 32, and then we would have added 1 to that, which means that we now end up with the value in age being 33. So in other words, on line 8, the question is being asked, is the value in age, which is 33, less than or equal to the value 25? And the answer there is that it is false, because it is not true that the value 33 is actually less than or equal to 25. So this statement equates to being false, which means that the value false is now being stored inside of printed. And we already know that if the if statement, or whenever the if statement evaluates to false, then the statements which are linked to the if statement will not be executed. We're going to clear the output. We're going to run the program again, but this time we're going to put in a value that will give us a true value being placed inside of printed. And we are going to see what difference or differences we observe when the program is executed. So let's clear. We are not troubling the program. We are simply going to run it with Bob, Marley, and the age that we know will be less than or equal to 25 once we enter it. So let's say 16. So we enter 16, it is converted to 16, then 16 plus 1 gives us 17. 17 is less than or equal to 25. So it therefore means that the statement would equate to true, which means that a true value is going to then be stored inside of printed. And because printed is true, then what it tells us is that all the statements which are linked to the if should actually execute. So we are going to hit enter on the age of 16. And there we have it. We have now displayed the fact that the first name is Bob, the last name is Marley, and the current age is now 17 because we had increased the age by 1. So what we have just demonstrated, in essence, is how we can incorporate conditionals into our program. What you'll commonly find, though, is that instead of having 2 separate lines, meaning line 8 and line 10, it is usually the custom to incorporate the logic that does the check to determine whether or not a true value or a false value is obtained. We just put that right on the same line with the if. In other words, let me comment out the line with print it. So we no longer have a printed variable. And let us use the statement that does the check. We're going to use it instead of print it. So note what we have done. We have gotten rid of the variable called print it. And we are simply making use of the statement itself that does the check. In other words, We want to check age directly and see if the value in age is less than or equal to the value 25. Let's clear our output and let's do a few checks. So Bob Marley, let's say that we enter the value 11. Well, 11 is going to be increased by 1, gives us 12. And the question is being asked, is 12 less than or equal to 25? The answer to that is yes. Therefore, we should be executing the print statements from lines 8 to 10. Let's see if that obtains. And we are seeing that it does obtain. We have gotten Bob Marley with the age now being 12. We're going to clear the output. And we are going to re-execute. But this time we're going to put in an age that we know will not work. So we are putting in the age 99. So 99 plus 1 gives us 100. The question is being asked, is 100 less than or equal to 25? And the answer to that is false, because 100 is not less than or equal to 25. It therefore means that lines 8 to 10 are going to be ignored. And after they are ignored, then we reach line 12. So let's see if that obtains. And we are seeing here, based on the output, that this is indeed the case. So we have not executed lines 8 to 10 because those lines are actually linked to the if statement. Now, in terms of completeness, let's just have a look at as possible syntax error. So let me get rid of the colon and let's re-execute. And notice it now says that there is a syntax error on line 7. So it is trying to give us the line that has the error. Line 7 is this line. And it tells us, or attempts to give us, a pretty good idea of what the problem is. And it's saying here that it expects to see a colon, but it's not seeing the colon. Now remember, I had indicated that it's important for us to place the colon at the end of the if statement. So if we clear and we re-execute, then you can see that the program runs and we are no longer experiencing a syntax error. So this is the if statement at work. And this is what I like to call the single if. And I call it the single if because it tells the computer what to do when the condition is true. But it does not tell what to do when the condition is false. In other words, we know that whenever the condition is true, we are supposed to print lines 8 and to 10, or execute lines 8 to 10. In this case, we have used print statements, which is why I keep on saying print. But it doesn't have to be print. It could have been something else, for example, a calculation. And as we do further examples, we'll have a look at this. But suffice it to say that the single if tells us what to do when the condition is true. In other words, we know the set of commands that are going to be executed whenever the condition is true. However, it does not tell us what to do when the condition is false. If we want to take into account what to do when the condition is false, then we are going to make use of something that I am going to call the double if. And this is usually signified by an if followed by an else. And in this case, it tells us what to do when the condition is true. And it also will tell us what to do when condition is false. So in other words, it will take care of both criterias or both conditions. It gives us what to do when condition is true, and it gives us what to do when condition is false. So how would that look? We put the else keyword followed by the colon, and we indent the commands that we want to execute whenever the condition is false. So let's print just some random statements. Else number 1. And let's go another time with another print statement. And we only need to indent once, please note. And let's say else number 2. So if the condition is false, then we want to print else number 1 and else number 2. So let us try that out and see that in action. So we stop in the program, and then we are going to re-execute. So this is our example of the double if. So it's Bob, Marley. We want to enter age. That is going to be false. So let's enter 99. So 99 plus 1 gives us 100. 100 is not less than or equal to 25. Therefore, the statement is actually false. If the statement is false, then it means that we end up at the else section. And when we are at the else section, the commands that are going to be executed are going to be the 2 print statements that will display the message else number 1 and else number 2. So let us hit the enter key. And based on the output, we're seeing that what we determined as the logic actually occurred. We print else number 1 and else number 2 simply because the condition that governs the if statement actually turned out to be false or evaluated to be false. And just to be clear, the statement that we're talking about in this case is the statement linked to the if, which is it is checking to see if the value in age is less than or equal to the value 25. So we have looked at the concept of conditionals, and we have covered 2 types of conditionals. One being the single if, where we know what to do when the condition is true, but we are not told what to do when the condition is false. And we also had a look at the double if, which tells us what to do when the condition is true, and also provides us with an option wherein we are able to know what to do when the condition is false. Before we end this particular session, I just want to take you back to our Python jottings. And as we look at our Python jottings, there are a few things which become important or very useful. For example, I made use of the comparison operations. And the one that I made use of particularly is the one here that talks about the less than or equal to. But there are others which are just as important, because we have the greater than or equal to. We have the greater than, we have the less than, we have the not equal to, and we have the equal to. Please note that the equal to is two equal signs, which is differentiated from the single equal sign, which means we are doing an assignment or we are storing a value. So that's something that you need to be aware of. When we are doing comparisons, it's the double equal sign that means equal or test for equality. The single equal sign is used for assignment, meaning we are storing a value. And if we go back to our program, then you are seeing that some of these things, operators, we have been making use of them because we have been making use of the assignment operator since we have started to talk about the code. In this case, we add 1 to age, and then we get a result, which is then stored back inside of it. In other words, we are updating the age variable with the value that we get when we look at the current value in age and we add 1 to it. So in this case, the example that we had just done, the initial age would have been 99. We would have added 1 to that 99, giving us 100, which means that the new value, which would have been used to update age, is actually going to be 100. This has taken us to the end of our second session, where we have looked at the whole concept of in particular, we have looked at the single if and the double if. There's also another conditional known as the multiple if that we will be looking at in our next session. So thank you and see you in the next one.